are things about that business that function differently with their ties to the land, for example, with farms. Whereas, a shop can always move to a different location and still be that shop. If I own a store, it can always continue on in a new place of business, right? If a new building isn't going to change that business in any way. In theory, anyway, I suppose it could. But with farms, definitely, it's the land itself is the farm, right? So, just because you can run one farm, if you move to a different location, it's a different farm now. It's not the same farm that maybe has been in the family for many generations. So there's a lot of more of a focus when you're talking about passing on the farm about how do we keep this farm going, right? Not just how do we make sure that you can run a successful business, which is certainly part of it, but how do we make sure that you can also continue to maintain this particular piece of property and make sure that that runs as smoothly as possible. So with that, we'll walk through a lot of different things about how that can be done, the types of things that you want to deal with. Again, for everyone just joining me now, I'm attorney Justin Randall with Hooper Law Office. Today, our topic that we're going to be going through is how to plan for farm succession and pass that on to the next generation. And as I was mentioning a second ago, a lot of what we talk about with farms can apply to a lot of different businesses, but there are certain focuses in farm planning that don't exist for other businesses, or just maybe aren't as much of a focus as they would be for a different type of business. So just a couple reminders before I go too in depth. After this is over, you'll be receiving an email with an article written by us. It kind of talks about farm planning and the types of things that you want to look at when you're doing that type of planning. And also, this is interactive, so you can send in questions through the Q&A, and I'll see them come up as I periodically look over. And I'll be able to answer them as we go along. And then at the end of this, part of that email that you'll receive as well is a place where you can fill out a feedback form that you'd like us to, if you would like us to, reach out to you to set up an initial consultation. So that is our, that's a place where you can fill out that you would like us to reach out to you if anything we talk about today is raises concerns for you, or you want to do some planning around it. We usually set up those initial consultations for about 2 hours. They are complimentary, so you're not paying to speak with us. So please feel free to set one of those up if anything we talk about interests you or concerns you in any way about your own situation. And then next week, what we're going to be talking about, our webinar topic is going to be on sort of the myths of estate planning, or things that common questions that people have when they're dealing with someone's estate, for example. So please feel free to sign up for that if you're interested in that topic as well. I think it definitely applies to a pretty broad group of people in terms of, everybody's going to have to deal with this at some point. All right. So to get started, when we're talking about farm planning, it's not just the current generation that we're talking about, right? We're also talking about passing things on and finding those people to pass things on to. And while that sounds relatively straightforward for a lot of people, right? Knowing that, well, I want it to stay in the family, I want it to go on to my kids, or I want them to run this equally. The practice of getting that done in a way that's not going to cause issues is also more complicated than it sounds, right? A lot of times there's considerations about how do we maintain this land if there's a lot of debt, right? How do we make sure that the next generation has a chance at success, or that they have a way to continue paying that debt that may exist on the farm? It's not uncommon for farms to have quite a bit of debt or liens against it as sort of an ordinary course of business. So if that is the case, you want to make sure that the next generation actually has a way to continue to maintain that debt, right? Or maintain the payments on it so that they don't end up losing the farm because of filing for bankruptcy, right? So debt is a really big part of any business, but in particular, because of a lot of like lines of credit and things like that with farms, it's possible that they may run a slightly higher level of debt to equity than, a different type of business would, right? So that's definitely one big factor in finding a way to make this work. It's not as simple as just passing that on. The other factor with passing on farms too is you want to make sure that you're picking the right people for the job, right? You want to make sure you're picking the right people to run that farm. And a lot of times there's this desire for things to be equal. You want things to be split equally amongst the kids. That's a very common desire. But are all of the kids involved in the farm? Do they want to continue being involved in the farm? I mean, do you know that every single one that you're passing it to has that desire, right? Because the desire is one of the most important parts of that. You want to make sure that, the people you're passing that to, if you want the business to continue or you want the farm to continue operating, you want to make sure that they actually want to do that. Because if they don't, and maybe one of them does and not the other, if you have two people involved, that could create some conflict for them, right? It makes it more difficult for the person that does want to continue to maintain that farm if one of the other owners wants out, right? Do they have the ability to buy them out? What types of restrictions are there on things like that? So making sure that you have an interest in continuing to maintain it is very important, right? Yeah, I think the current, a lot of times when I see this issue come up, it's probably exacerbated a little bit by the more and more, it seems like there are family members who maybe have moved on from the farm or have gone and done other careers, right? It's not as much as it used to be where it's, I was born and raised on the farm, I'm going to continue it. If that's what somebody wants, that's great. But I think the current generation has had a little bit more of a difficulty maintaining that desire, whether that's competition from like larger corporate farms or milk price is a common thing I hear about. That can be really difficult for people or a big concern for people going into the next generation. But if they have that desire, if they have that strong desire to continue operating the farm, then they're a good fit for it, right? Or at least a good initial candidate. When the other part of making sure that you're picking the right people is, what level of experience do these people have operating this? Were they involved in the farm the entire time? Have they continued to be involved in it? Do they know how to run it? Do they have experience, doing the accounting for the farm and the business aspect of it, or do they need someone who can help them with that? This is true of any business, of course, where you're looking at picking someone to maintain that business. But with farms, I think the line gets a little bit blurred sometimes for families with, well, this is my farm, but it is also a business. So they don't view it as much so as that kind of hands-off approach with the business. They're not hands-off, but sort of that, I am separate from this, right? That's where farm planning is so much different than just standard business succession planning is. I could pass on the business to a new owner. If I, run a law firm, right? For example, I could pass that on to another attorney at some point without it needing to be in our current building. With the farm, that land has very often been in the family for generations. It's not uncommon for me to have clients who have the farm in the family for more than 100 years, right? Which is a long time. So, I mean, sometimes it's far enough back that it might even be pretty close to the start of the state of Wisconsin, right before it was actually an official state. So that, there's obviously much more weight on that land than there would be for any other business. So the stressor there is obviously making sure that land can continue to be in the family. There's more of a focus on that than there would be with any other business. When you're talking about getting it to the next generation, it's not just getting it there and making sure that financially it works out either. There's a lot of focus that needs to be put on how is this going to continue to operate once the next generation owns it. It's not as simple as passing it to them and making it, they just own it, right? I mean, that sounds simple, and the initial transfer might be simple, but there's a lot of issues that can come up with that. And this is where people often don't think about these things or have these discussions, whether because they don't, they're afraid of the answer to this question potentially, or they just don't think it's ever going to be an issue. But you want to make sure, like with any business, that somebody has the ability to deal with disputes of ownership, right? Or disputes of management, making sure they have a rule book that they can follow, making sure they have liability protection if something goes wrong, right? And making sure that maybe they have rules on who they can leave things to ownership in the farm, going forward. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about there, a lot of times, if you ask somebody who owns a business, and I'm sure this would be true of a lot of farm owners as well, you ask them, do you want to run this business with so-and-so's spouse, right? Do you want to continue operating it with their wife? Very often the answer to that question is no, or not particularly, right? That doesn't mean they don't like the spouse, but maybe they don't want to continue operating it that way. So you really need to make sure that that next generation maybe has some guidelines of how they can do that succession planning themselves later on. Do they have rules of who can inherit the property or who can continue to own the business and operate it? So if the goal is to keep it in the family and maybe in your direct descendants, maybe you put restrictions on that when you're doing that farm planning of who they are allowed to leave things to, or what happens if one of them passes unexpectedly. Sort of dealing with those sort of unforeseen circumstances is very important with any business, but in a farm in particular, you want to make sure that if the goal is to keep it in that family and keep the land in the family going generations forward, that you have restrictions on that. Because otherwise what tends to happen is if I pass away and I just own something, if my will or my trust or however I owned the property said everything goes to my spouse and there's no restrictions on that transfer, that could be what happens. And then of course, if that spouse is not interested in owning it and they're trying to sell it, that could disrupt the operation of the farm or the business if the other owner cannot purchase it out. How you deal with a lot of these issues before they become issues is while you continue to own your farm, before you actually pass it on to the next generation, whether that's during your lifetime or after you pass away, you create those rules now so that you're not letting other people or the next generation argue about them, right? If you set up those rules, you're the only one who has to sign off on that, or you and your spouse. So with farms in particular, you might say, I want to keep it in the family. And therefore, if I'm going to put the rules of operation in the business that say you can't pass it on to somebody who is not a direct descendant of so-and-so, right? Or of me, or it has to first be offered to the other owners of the farm before, another outside person could be brought in as an owner, right? Those are the sorts of things that you need to account for, because unexpected things like, passing away unexpectedly, obviously, is the most common thing that you would hear about creating an issue for a business. Making sure you have those in place, those restrictions in place, is very important. So another thing that can be a really big dispute or reason for dispute is one of the things I mentioned earlier can play a role in this too, is making sure that if somebody isn't interested in the farm and they decide they want out, how is that land valued? What process does that person have to go through in order to get out of that business or to purchase the other person's interest if they're maintaining that business? What you want is a structure in place for somebody to see, okay, what are the rules of getting an appraisal? What happens if we disagree with that appraisal? Do we agree on a price? How do we deal with that sort of dispute? Because cost is very important when it comes to purchasing a business. Obviously, it's one of the biggest points of contention or negotiation with any business. But again, with farms, if there's not a lot of liquid capital to do that purchase, that could be a huge issue. So those sorts of rules you can put in place now. How you put these rules in place is if you don't already have something like this, when you're talking about owning your farm as a business, you want to have some sort of business entity generally set up for owning that, right? So very often you'll hear about farms owned by like an LLC, or maybe as sometimes maybe not the land, but the business side of it is run as a corporation. I mean, there's a lot of different business structures you can put in place to continue to operate that. And those business agreements, so if you're talking about an LLC, for example, it would be the operating agreement. That's where you put in that you would want, restrictions on transfer or restrictions on pricing or valuation, right? Who that next generation can go to, or who the recipients can be of if somebody passes away and where that ownership can go. You put those sorts of things in an operating agreement. You can also put them in buy-sell agreements. So there's a lot of different agreements you can use to restrict the transfer to who you would want it to be limited to. I think with that restriction of transfer, another very important thing to keep in mind is how many people can continue to own this farm, right? So it may not be an issue going into the next generation, right? I mean, it might be you and your spouse passing on to your 2 kids or onto your 4 kids or however many people are going to be involved. and you're not going to have, a million different people owning it at this point. But what can happen if you don't restrict it further is after a while, land ownership can start to get divided and divided and divided to the point where it's just unmanageable. I was talking with one of the other attorneys in our office today, and they mentioned this was not a farm, but they brought up an example of somebody who had a 240th interest in something because of there was no planning done to limit ownership. This was just a deed, of course, just a normal piece of property, not necessarily a farm or a business. But if you don't put restrictions on that and everybody in the world is allowed to pass on their interest however they want to as many people as they want, you can imagine how that would create an issue for management going forward or managing that farm. So restricting ownership, not just to the type of people it can go to, or then the class of people it can go to, but also making sure that you are restricting the number of owners as well at some point. That can be difficult because it's hard to know how many would want to own a business, but I mean, you want to make sure that somebody is not getting to a point where if that business is going on to the next generation, that it doesn't fail at some point because of it just being unmanageable in terms of how many people have a say and what types of disputes come up because of just how many people are involved in those sorts of discussions, right? So making sure that those rules are in place, that you have that operating agreement in place is very important. With the LLC or a business entity, another added benefit of one of those things is, as with any business, there's liability if, or potential for liability, I should say, if something happens on the property or something happens with the business. And what you really want to do in order to make sure that that business is separate from the owners of that business in terms of assets is have that separation of a business entity from personal assets, right? So, I think with farms, a lot of farmers I've seen now do have some sort of business entity, but I think in the past it was, well, I live here, this is my home and it's my business. So it was sort of blurred the lines a little bit more than it would if I just went into an office every day and that was my place of business, because I don't live in the office. So that's the sort of thing where it's a little different for farm planning because there is that separate kind of connection to it, or a closer connection to the actual business itself, the land of the business. But what you would want to do is make sure that the next generation, then their liabilities or from the business don't prohibit them from being able to continue it if something would attach to them personally in terms of like a liability or a lien or a creditor type issue. So making sure that they're able to continue successfully running that, and that separation from liability is important. And of course, I would always recommend on top of that, somebody have pretty good liability insurance for any sort of business that they're running to make sure that if, that something does happen with the business itself has some protection. When we're talking about passing things on, right? It's not just the ability to plan for the next generation, but there's things in your own life that can come up quite a bit when we're talking about passing on farms or business. When it comes to the land or the value of the home, that there's obviously a lot of value in farmland. I mean, I don't know the exact going price right now, but tillable land, last somebody mentioned to me, was $7,000 an acre, right? So there's a lot of value in it. But a very common concern for farmers is, how do I protect this in the event that I need to go into long-term care, right? The concern is the nursing home going to take this farm from me? Are they going to make me sell it? Are they going to put a lien on it as they provide care, right? How do we stop this from happening? How do we ensure that this does go on to the next generation? And there are ways to protect it, and there are things that you want to do if that's a concern. As with any sort of discussion on long-term care, one of the first things you can look at yourself is looking at long-term care insurance and seeing if that makes sense for you. Long-term care insurance is different than when you're talking about like long-term disability insurance. It's not AFLAC we're not talking about, but it specifically pays for long-term care in a nursing home, assisted living, at home potentially, depending on the situation. So that can help you avoid that sort of lien being placed on the farm. I do have a question. How can I avoid inheritance tax on the farm? So when somebody passes away, there's sort of two types of taxes when people are talking about inheritance tax that they could be mentioning. So inheritance tax is the person receiving the farm actually paying an inheritance on the receipt of that farm, not on sale, or not the estate paying it, right? Thankfully, there is no federal inheritance tax, and there's no state in Wisconsin anyway. There's no state level estate tax here, or inheritance tax, excuse me. So there shouldn't be any inheritance tax if it's a Wisconsin farm. Estate tax is where the estate is paying it if it's over a certain size. So the federal exemption for that currently is about 12.06 million this year per person. So for a married couple, it'd be, over 24 million. Wisconsin also does not have a state level estate tax. So there is no concern from the state of Wisconsin on how much you pass on. Now, if the farm and other assets together are over that 12 or 24 million, depending on if you're single or married, that could be an issue that you need to plan around. And there are a lot of ways to help pay those inheritance taxes or estate taxes, a lot of more complex planning options to help avoid that. If you're under that amount, you don't have to pay estate taxes. So that shouldn't be an issue for a lot of people, even farms that are relatively large. Most don't get to the level of like a $24 million farm, although some I'm sure are. In terms of the tax that is more of an issue for farms that somebody should be aware of is capital gains tax. So that would be the one I would worry way more about. And if things are set up the way they should be, ideally, when the original owners of the farm pass away, that cost basis in the farm, basically, what is it worth to that person if they were to sell it? How much of a gain would they have from the difference? That cost basis can get adjusted to fair market value at the date of death, right? If it's part of that person's estate. So what that means is the next generation, if they were to sell it right away, there would be very little to no capital gains tax, depending on how long they've held on to it. Where things can become an issue with farms, I think in particular, is when it comes to long-term care planning. You often hear the question from everybody, not just farmers, but a very common question is, should I put the home in the kid's name, right? Or should I put the farm in the kid's name to protect it from my long-term care costs? That's, especially if you're worried about taxes, is a terrible idea. One of the biggest reasons that that's a terrible tax idea is when you gift property over to somebody, you transfer your cost basis to that person. They don't get it at fair market value when you die. So the issue there is if you're worried about selling the farm, or if there's any, you're trying to do just depreciation planning tax-wise with the farm later on, the next generation is going to have a much, much lower cost basis in it than they should if they had inherited it the right way. So especially with these farms that have been in the family for generations, if you think about it, when maybe you inherited this farm 50 years ago or however long, I mean, that might be way longer than it was, but however many years ago, that might be your cost basis. What was the value then? And that's a very simplified explanation for it. There can be a lot of other factors, but think of it as whatever the value was when you inherited it. If that's what the kids get it at, the next generation gets it at, there are going to be a lot more limitations on the tax planning they can do. There's going to be a sale. If there is a sale, there's going to be a very large chunk of capital gains tax to pay on it, because it's at that point, the value difference was probably going to put you into that 20% capital gains rate for most people. So that would be the tax. I know that was not quite what you were asking, but that would be the tax I would be more worried about. I would not worry about the inheritance or estate tax issue. The estate tax issue, if the estate of the person passing on is over 12.06 for a single person million, or over 24 million roughly for a married couple, then that's a little different. There's other planning that you would need to do to help avoid that. But there are ways to do that too, especially when you're talking about making sure that it at least either doesn't apply to the farm, or that there's ways to pay that liability without it impacting the farm. So I know that was a long-winded answer to that question, but if for most people, you don't have to worry about that type of tax. You have to worry way more about the capital gains issue. But if the estate plan is done properly, that can be avoided entirely for most people. So I would say, just make sure that before you do that transfer planning, before you're looking at that it is not gifted, because gifting it can be just a huge problem for that capital gains tax later on, especially if maybe the goal isn't to continue the operation of the farm, but it is to sell it, right? There are better ways to protect things from long-term care than by gifting it to the kids directly. So there's other things that I would recommend. So one of them I mentioned was long-term care insurance. First thing that you'd want to look at. The next would be potentially looking at maybe putting the farm into an irrevocable trust, the land into an irrevocable trust, right? If that's doable for that person, where it makes sense to do it. Maybe they're not operating the business side of it anymore. Maybe the kids have started that, but they still own the land. That can provide protection after 5 years for protection from long-term care expenses, meaning they can't be attached to that farm, or the state recovery and Medicaid in Wisconsin can't come after it after you've passed away. But when you do that type of planning, it still gets that step up in basis as long as it's a part of that person's taxable estate. And I say taxable estate in that it could be taxed if it was over that amount. It doesn't mean it actually will be. Amount meaning the like 12 or 24 million. So getting that step up in basis is something that an irrevocable trust can still do without, the gifting it to the kids issues. So there's a lot of planning that you can do if you're trying to protect the farm, not just from your care for the next generation. You want to do tax planning for them. There's better ways to do it than just signing a deed, right? I think it sounds like it's the easiest often, but it often isn't. So I did get a question. I thought I could give $15,000 a year. Is that not true? So that $15,000 a year gift tax exemption, it's actually this year it's now $16,000. It went up finally after like however many years, but that is only for gift tax purposes through the IRS. Medicaid says you can gift $0 away without it being a divestment. They don't play with the same rules, unfortunately. So there is no safe harbor for that type of dollar amount for Medicaid planning. So if you're worried about nursing home expenses, there is no amount, that $15,000 or $16,000 this year does not apply to Medicaid's rules. So that look back period that you may have heard of, the 5-year rule, that still applies to those transfers. There are some arguments that you can try to make that it wasn't done in anticipation of Medicaid and needing Medicaid and all of that. Those are very difficult to win and generally not worth the argument because you're spending more to fight it than you're gaining. So I would say don't do that gifting planning thinking that you're getting away with a safe harbor rule or that you're protecting it without it not being a problem, because it will be. And you will have to report it. You can't just not tell them about it. One, they can request, they will request bank records. So if they see this amount of money being gifted away, it's a problem. And then two, if you lie about it, it's fraud. So it's not worth it to do that. The other, where that rule comes into play, what that gift tax actually is talking about is if you go over that $16,000 per year, per person, you have to file a gift tax return, which then that 12.06 million that you each individually have gets lowered by the amount you went over. So if I gifted $100,000 to somebody tomorrow, I would have to file a gift tax return, but that wouldn't mean I suddenly had to pay tax on it. Only if I had already exceeded my lifetime exemption would I then have to pay tax on it. So that's what that gift tax rule, that exclusion is talking about. It is not talking about Medicaid. It is a very common misconception or question that we get though, because it sounds like it should be, right? I mean, it sounds like it should be the same rule, but it's what you realize very quickly when you start to read these rules is they don't care what the other agencies say, right? Or what the different rules say. They're for different reasons. So, no, that's a very good question though. But unfortunately not for Medicaid. It is true if you're doing estate tax planning that you could do that, but if you anticipate needing Medicaid, I would not do it for that purpose, or anticipate not having enough just to privately pay for your care for as long as you need to. I wouldn't do that as a way to protect things from long-term care. So the irrevocable trust is a way to still protect things if that's a goal of yours to protect it from care. So, I mean, protecting the business from care is very important, mostly because there are limitations of what someone can have when they're in need of care, right? In terms of what Medicaid allows that person to keep. From married couples, as long as one of the spouses is still living in the home, The primary home is exempt from having to be spent down. However, that can get a little more complicated, especially with farms, depending on how many parcels there are. If it's separate parcels, if they're over the like cap and value that you're allowed to keep. So that can complicate things. And it's with farmers in particular, because a lot of farmers have a lot of their net worth in the land itself and not as much in maybe liquid cash, because that would involve selling the farm, right? Which is often not the goal. It is even more important to think about this type of planning earlier on than it might be for somebody else, because if I'm trying to protect things from my care and my home's only worth a couple $100,000, but I have all of my investments and things like that, and I have the ability to pay out of that, I have that ability to pay. I don't need to worry as much about, oh, what happens if, I don't make it out to 5 years and the home is there, right? And I have to tell them about that transfer. With farmers, because so much of that value is tied to the land, you need to plan around it as if, okay, if we need care, we may not have access to money to spend for like a penalty period that you've created for Medicaid. So I would say definitely with farmland in particular, if the goal is to maintain it in the family, and I mean, I suppose if you don't care and you're just trying to sell it, there's always that option, but I know that's not the goal for most people. So if you're trying to maintain that land and you're not going to just be able to take money out of it, right? Protecting it earlier and getting around that 5 years for Medicaid is very important, because you don't want to have to have that create an issue for you down the road. So that 5-year rule just means when you apply for Medicaid, they look back 5 years from that date of application to see if you transferred anything. So if you're beyond that 5 years, if you're 5 years in a day, in theory, it is, you don't tell them about it. You're not required to. So there's a lot of planning you can do for that if maintaining the farm from care is important. Again, long-term care insurance, the benefit of that is you don't have to do as much like trust-based planning sometimes, depending on that. Maybe you do both. It's the first step I would say look at doing. There are some exceptions with farms because they're potentially an operating business from being Medicaid available. But the issue comes into play a lot where if the family has already started that transition of the business where they are sort of just owning the land and maybe renting it to the business entity that owns the farm now, maybe the kids are the owners of the business entity. If it's not an active business, meaning you yourself, the owner of the land, are not actively involved, there's a pretty good argument that that's not protected by itself just because it's a business entity. So I would say, you want to make sure that if long-term care is your concern, you do that planning well in advance. And it looks like I'm running low on time here. I know this is a very long-winded topic or a very complicated topic, and I could go on for much longer than this, but I don't see any other questions, but just as a reminder, keep an eye out for that email with the feedback form and the article about this type of planning. If you would like us to reach out to you to set up a time to talk and go through this with you and your family, remember those are complimentary initial consultations. We do set them up for about 2 hours. So we try to budget as much time as we can for it. But please feel free to fill that out if anything has raised concerns or you want to talk about the most efficient way to do this type of planning. And then next week, again, our topic, if you're interested, is I guess our title for it is do my children inherit my debt when I die, and other important questions. But really the topic is going to be about kind of some misconceptions that people run into or have about what happens after a parent passes away, or what happens after they pass away if they're talking about their kids. We're going to be talking about a lot of either whether those are true or whether they're myths, or it's a really helpful, I think, sort of summary of a lot of the things that are slightly different than people actually expect them to be, and where people run into issues administering a parent's estate. And if you want to sign up for that, it's at estateplanninglive.com, as you can sign right up right there, and pretty simple to do. Anyway, I will wish you guys a happy day then, and I will see you all next week.